we're building a timeline, and we're doing who I was then, am now, and will be in there, and we're using all posts, and you're being introduced to custom fields and how to use custom fields and what exactly they are. As a result of that, your WordPress pages, you complete 4 WordPress pages. As a byproduct of that, there's something called a WordPress API. So who can tell me what an API is? Anybody? No? Nope. Application Program Interface. Can anybody tell me what it does? So an API is the way, like our phones and things like that, access information and data in other systems off of other servers, right? And what's become very popular in recent years is JSON and something we call REST API. And what makes a REST API so great, when you hear the word REST API, what makes it so great is for a REST API, for it to truly be a REST API, there has to be this series of elements that exist in our link. And if you look, we're saying, hey, we want a JSON response from WordPress, use version 2, because there's different versions, and what we want is posts. And by the way, we only want the posts that are in the category 12, and the offset is how pagination. So when you're on a website and there's like a list of something and there's like 20, and then it says load more, or page 2, page 3, page 4, right? That's called pagination. And what happens is it's so that you don't get this like 1,000 results at one time and you're waiting for your page to load and waiting for your page to load. What you do is you take 10, and then those 10 come, and then you take 10 more, right? So you offset by 10 to get the next 10, offset by 20 to get the next 10. So incrementally in your code, which you'll see that we're doing, you actually count these numbers up. All right. The server seems to be very upset with me right now. And it might be because it's running a maintenance backup, which wouldn't surprise me, which is somewhat frustrating. What's funny is that I'm still getting information over here. Okay, it's not funny anymore because I'm not getting the information anymore. We'll let this server have a second to go, and let's talk about what we're going to do. I'm inside the I page, and we're going to do this for each of our pages under I for the timeline and things like that. First thing, what do we do when we go start working in a page right now? What's the first thing we do? Okay, save it. But now we're in the code, and we're getting ready to work in code. What's the first thing you should do when you first start working in your page code?
Collapse everything.
Collapse what you don't need, right? So that header takes up like 100 lines of code or whatever it is. And if we collapse it, now we're down here to just our page. And if we collapse footer, right, it leaves us even more to work around. We're going to add a couple files which will be supplied to you, and the code will be supplied to you as well. But we're going to add a couple things. We're going to add in Bootstrap, which we added in our websites part of the project, if you can recall. Of course, we're going to bring in our own styles, and we're going to actually add another one called Timeline CSS that we're going to create real quickly. And that's what's going to allow us to do this, the way that our page is laying out with the bubbles on both sides. The goal around the project is to essentially to put your birth date, starting with the day that you were born, and then one event that happened around that time. I have some extras, which is fine, but I would encourage you, right, to do that. I'm going to do one more refresh, which I shouldn't do. We're going to do a little preloader. You're going to learn how to do a little preloader on your page. server is definitely angry today. There we go. Good. We're back. All right. So we'll do that preloader, which you saw. We'll bring in our elements, and then we'll place them on this timeline. And we're going to do that all with JavaScript, including calling out to the server and getting the information from the server. This information, if you look in our code, this is our timeline. This is our UL. Nothing in it. And what we're doing with JavaScript is we're calling out to the server, and what we're calling out to is the API. And what the API is giving us is information. We're basically saying post category 12, and your category might be different. It's whatever the category timeline number is, and I'll show you how to grab that. And we're just looking at this, but this will actually dynamically change. So right now, we're getting the first 10 response, right? And if I collapse these and look at them, my first one is 727. If I offset by 10, I'm saying give me the next 10. Super slow server. Oh my goodness. Wait, see what happens here real quick. You see that my ID changed to 651. That's because it took the next 10, it took 11 through 20, and returned that to me as far as the posts go. By the way, where you get your ID for your AJAX call, if we go into post categories, we create a category called timeline in step 17. And if you look at it, if you hover over top of it, you'll see down in the very bottom of my screen, it shows the link. You probably can't see it. You'll see it on the video, and I'll put a pointer to it. But you'll actually see the ID down there. Additionally, if I click on it, you can see up here, category and tag ID, right? Mine is 12. And that's where you'll pull, right? That's where you'll pull your ID that you use in your code that I'm going to give you. So let's go out and look at what we're doing. We're basically doing the same thing on all 4 pages with a little bit of variation in the way that the code, the JavaScript is written. First thing we're doing is we're adding in some libraries. We kind of talked about libraries a little bit. Bootstrap is basically a library that allows us to do a page layout in responsive HTML5 with very little work. We're leveraging someone else's work, essentially, is what we're doing. Same thing with jQuery, right? We're using functions. We're using JavaScript that someone else wrote in order to get our JavaScript completed. We're coming down, and again, remember, you're not expected to be a coding expert out of this. What the expectation is for you to realize, like, wow, I could write a website, and I could pull data from 18 different places and bring it all together in this website so that I can display it and leverage it without having to maintain it. Or, great example, you have a car lot with 5 lots on it. You have one server where you keep a list of all those cars, and then from each lot, there might be an application, a web page, or something, right, from different places that call this API and pull that data, and they're able to use the same data. So you're managing the data in one place, distributing it to multiple places, and that really is the big idea here. But to give you some insight on how that happens, what we do in JavaScript is we come in, and there's these things called event listeners in JavaScript. So event listeners are like if you have a button on the page. Through JavaScript, through code, you say, hey, browser, watch that button. When somebody clicks on it, do this. And that's what an event listener is. In this case, We're using JavaScript to tell the browser, hey browser, watch the window. So the window is what we look at in the web page, right? Watch the window. And after everything is loaded, including those external libraries that we talked about and stuff, do this. Well, so what happens when you load the page, it kind of puts that in a queue, and it's waiting for the browser and everything to get done loading, because the browser will report back and say, got everything you asked for, done loading, right? And when that happens, because we put this event listener on here, it then says, call the get timeline function. So a function, how many of us know what a function is? It's not just JavaScript. Somebody explain it to me. Anybody?
Like a step-by-step thing, something like that, action.
It can play a part in a step-by-step thing, yeah.
It's a chunk of code that can be reused multiple times without having to retype everything.
Yes, it's a chunk of code. Or what we would call a code block, right? That is tucked away into this little drawer called a function that we can use over and over and over again for different, as long as we want the same result, right? For many different things. So a great example of that, let's say we make a function that takes a string of characters and it makes them all uppercase. We can use that function all over the place, right? Not just for one thing. We could use that for many different things. Let's say we write a function that checks when you're filling out a form to make sure that there's something in that form. Well, you could have 70 different forms, all different things, all different places, and we could use that one function to check for whether something was inside the field or not, right? Functions are pretty much in every programming language that exists. Functions are in those of you in IT. If you get into routers and things like that, you'll probably use Python, different languages. Functions are there. And we create functions when we find ourselves using the same pieces of code more than once, right? Because it makes no sense to write them one place and then write them again in another place and write them again in another place when we could just use this little thing and call it and have it bring it out. Now, functions get pretty complicated. We can pass information into the function by using parameters. We call them parameters and arguments. We're not going to get into that, but we can actually do that from outside when we first call the function. We're going to see down here where we actually call the function from inside itself as well. Yes, sir.
No, I was going to ask about that parameter thing. You say you're going to not explain how it works.
No, I'm going to, but not from out here where we're doing a dry call. I'll explain it down in here real quick. So we have the function. How many of us know what variables are? You do? You want to explain it real quick? You want to take a shot?
Anything you can assign anything for a variable.
Yeah. So variable really is like this little temporary container that we can put tuck information to. We can change that information, but the reason that we use it, variables, the biggest reason is you'll see down here we have counter, right? And what we want to do, in 1 second. What we want to do is we want this variable, when it comes into the function, we want this variable counter to be set to the current count, which is 0. So this is an example of passing parameters, arguments into parameters. This is really just a variable up here. The equals 0 is for this case. When we don't send anything to it, right, it needs to have a default value kind of thing. So its default is 0. So in other words, if nothing is passed in that parameter, it just takes on the value of 0. If something is passed in, it takes on the value of whatever has been passed in. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah. So it's like mostly a function or something like that.
You could look at it that way, right? So what we're doing here is when we call this function, we're not passing in a parameter. So it's saying, hey, I don't have a parameter. I don't have an argument for this parameter, so I'm going to assign it the value of 0. It seems a little silly, but then we come down inside here and we say, take the value of this cur count, right, CNT, and assign it to counter. And the reason that we're doing this, we'll get to the other stuff in a minute. The reason that we're doing this is because we know most of us are going to have more than 10 posts. We don't want to go out and say, give me all the posts at one time, because that bogs down your application. So down here, don't worry if this doesn't make a ton of sense to you, but basically what we're doing with this piece of code is we're looking at it at this in its entirety. We know that WordPress gives us 10 at a time. And by the way, inside this is what we would call an object, and this is what we would call an object too, by the way. But what we're looking at is this high-level object, and we're saying how many are in that object, right? And if it's greater than or equal to 1 for right now, we're going to call the same function that we're inside of. And this is called recursive. I don't expect you that recursion it gets really complicated. But what's beautiful about it is that in a case like this, it'd be silly to make another function to call the next 10 and make another function to call the next 10. It would be absolutely asinine to do that, right? So what we do is we say, okay, there's obviously some left. So let's call this function again, but let's set the counter. Let's set the argument that comes into this parameter up here, right, to whatever the count is plus 10. And so what results from that, if I come in here and I inspect my code, and I go out and I look at network, and I hit refresh. There's the first one. There's the second one. There's the third one. See how it just added 10 on? If you look at this link that I'm hovering over, right? It looks exactly like the one that we have inside our function up here, except the number changes. 0, that's the first time it came in. 10, we call it ourselves again. 20, we called ourselves again. 30, we called ourselves again. On the 30th one, we got 0. And because we had 0, right, it skipped this. This is what's called if then else. And so what I did is I called another function, which we'll talk about in a minute or two, and that's called a wrap up. In the meantime, when we're getting this information, what it's doing is it's passing in objects. Just like you saw out here, right? It's passing in that information, and the browser is building up objects. So each one of your posts is like this little packet of information, this little pamphlet that you can use anywhere in your site now, right? Yeah, and it's pulling the data over. It's pulling information over. Well, what we're going after in the data, before I switch back over, is content, which you can see here. This is the code for the content. You can see my picture in there. You can see the image in there. You can see all the information in there, along with the formatting, which is nice. That's what the rendered is. We're looking for a title for a space shuttle to launch, right? And we're gathering all this information. And our browser, through more code, we're telling it to go out and create each one of these pieces of information. Throw this pamphlet on the page, right? It's looping through each one and adding it to the page. So that all happens right here, which again, don't worry, the code is copy and paste. It'll be available, so don't get overwhelmed by that concept. The only thing you really have to change in here is whatever the category is that when you create the timeline category, whatever number that is. It's the only thing you really have to manipulate in the code. All this is doing is pulling all that together and creating this block. So if I right click on this and I inspect it and I look, we can see, by the way, let me start up here. We know on our page, right, we have a UL timeline, class timeline. Right here. Pay attention to the fact containers above that, contents above that, right? And if we come out, we look at the DOM, right? We see the same structure that we see in our code. Content, container. Marco, did you have a question or just scratching? All right, buddy. Container and timeline. But in our code, timeline is just this empty, unordered list, right? That's because in our code, what we're doing is we're building these pieces that we want on the page, and then we're saying, hey, in the timeline, that's a class, and it's pointing to this. Inside that timeline, I want you to take this, which is this block, right? We say PG build equals all this code. Take PG build and put it inside a timeline. For each one of those posts, you can see what we've done, right, is put that piece of information in there. Does that make sense? And we can see that that piece of information includes the badge. And if you study this when you do the homework, that's up to you. It's again, I want you to get the concept. If you're in development program, I would study this and try to understand, deeper what's going on. Or if you're into this, study it and understand deeper what's going on. So if I look, that's the element that I stuck into the page. If you look at that. Inside that element is the panel that I stuck into the page. Here's the panel heading. Here's the content. Oh, sorry, not the content. This is the date, right? I come down to the timeline body. Inside the body, now all this next to this caret is what I brought over from my object from WordPress. So you can see the images sitting there, right? You can see the content is right below it. Image, content, it's your paragraph. And then after that, we go ahead and we put in our badge, we'll call it, which is right here, our timeline badge. And to be honest with you, it's actually structurally in the DOM above the rest of our information, but with CSS, we place it right in the middle of the page on that line. Who's completely confused by this? You don't have to understand exactly what's going on, but do you get the concept? So where's the big wow in what we're learning here? Who can tell me what the big wow is in what we're learning here? What I'm trying to get across to you.
JavaScript and the function, how it looks.
JavaScript is a beautiful thing, yes sir, and the functions and what you can do with them. Even bigger than that.
Taking information from other sources and putting it.
Right. Having that capability, understanding that it's really not that difficult to connect other sources together, to bring things together, right? To leverage, why should he, let's say FDA comes in and says, you must be able to supply all ingredients in all ingredients, right? So the ingredients that make the ingredients in the products that you make and things like that. And Anthony's like, oh my God, that's like a 3-month thing. I got to reach out to the vendor. I got to get the information. I got to bring it back. I got to format it. I got to make it look nice. As where with this information, Anthony knows enough now, maybe not to do it himself, but he knows enough now. Let me talk to a web developer, because I know that this flower company and this company and that company have APIs with all their information. I'm going to talk to someone because I know it's possible, instead of me doing that, I know it's possible for someone to write a function in a piece of code to go out and grab that information, bring it back and format it and present it for me. And so 3 months of work now becomes 3 days of work. You know, that's the way to really, that's the big wow takeaway from this. And it's important for you to know as a developer, because it should excite you as a developer. If you're going to be a developer, this kind of thing should excite you. This should be like, yeah, man, this is awesome. That means I can, you know, if I want to show what concerts are going on in Reading on my website, I can actually write script and go out to Ticketmaster, to StubHub, to all these different places that offer APIs. And I can say, hey, give me all show information, all tickets you have available for Reading, Pennsylvania. And it returns all of them, and you display them. You've just consolidated, because they're not going to do each other's, right? Now you've just captured the Hillbilly Blues Band and Robert Plant and Nelly, right? All in, I'm showing my age, all in the same place, where you won't get that by going there. And that's what one of the things that makes it really exciting. All right, so back to the code a little bit.
I was just going to ask if that's how like things like the Echo Dot and Google Home work when you try asking them for things to just go out to other sources.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I can't say that for fact, but I haven't been able to dig in yet. I'm excited. I can't wait to be able to dig in. But I'm very confident that Wikipedia, Google itself, different sources that make APIs available, which I would love to have Amazon's API list, because I'm sure they have a list of 1 million sites out there that provide information back to you, which if you're going to be a developer, or if you're going to be touched by development, that should be an exciting freaking concept to you, right? Because as developers, last thing we want to do is manage data, write it and things like that. Hell with that. I'd much rather get it from somewhere else. I'd much rather. But yeah, Marco, I'm fairly certain that that Alexa, when you like right now, hey Alexa, ask Santa's elves for an update, which I hear about 40 times a day in my house, right? The people who wrote the Alexa skill, Santa's update, right? Ask Santa's elves. I'm sure that they have a server somewhere that Amazon connects, goes out, grabs a response very similar to this, and then Alexa just verbalizes the return. That's kind of oversimplifying it, but I'm sure it's really not much more difficult. To be honest with you, I don't think it's much more difficult than what we're doing in this assignment. I think if you can wrap your head around what's going on in this assignment, I think you could probably go out, and I don't know for a fact yet, but I think you could probably go out, type in Google, write Alexa app. You wrote an Alexa app, right? So Marco's he wrote an Alexa app actually, and has been noticed by Amazon for writing it. Which awesome. Rock on, brother. But I'm sure it wasn't really, you have some programming knowledge and skills, but I'm sure it wasn't over the top for you, right?
Yeah, it wasn't over the top.
No. So, and if you can follow step-by-step instructions and have some confidence in coding, you probably can write something somewhat simple. Would you agree with that or disagree?
Yeah, I would agree.
You would agree. Thank you, sir. But yeah. So, we'll go back and we'll look in the code. And up to this point, do we have any questions about like this page builder? If you look in the top, we declare the variable. In the beginning, it's always good to declare variables, right? To say, hey, I'm going to use this, I'm going to call this variable this, and we're going to use this. And again, all you're doing is making little buckets to hold information in, right? I'm going to declare these variables. This variable this is what we call an object. So, or one might be tempted to call it an array. And so what this variable is basically just a bunch of variables inside one variable. And the reason that we do that is, in this case, what we want to do is we want to be able to pass along information, and we want to pass information that is in groups, right? So basically, I have 4 buckets in here that I put information in, and they're little buckets, and then I have a bigger bucket that I stick them all in, and then I just send off the big bucket instead of 4 little buckets, one at a time. I send off the big bucket. Does that make sense? No? Yeah? Okay, good. This is probably one of the greatest developments in web, in my opinion. And I've been using Ajax since Ajax has not been popular, and not because I'm special or whatever. I was a part of, the minority, let's put it that way, a very small minority, where I can remember about 10 years ago being at Adobe Max. If you go into development, I encourage you to, if you go into this industry in IT period, I encourage you to go talk to your employer when you get hired, even negotiate in your hiring. Like I would like a budget to go to convention, at least one convention a year. My budget, my ask was always $5,000 to go to Adobe Max. And what's cool about it, at Adobe Max, there you are with 5 to 10,000 developers, all like-minded people in these workshops and these really cool, things, learning things and kind of challenging the fringe, going out on the edge. And there was a point about 10 years ago where I sat in a room with maybe about 6 other people, and on the door it said, we believe in Ajax. And the rest of the world, outside of people like myself, believed that this had nothing. It was kind of like when IBM handed over the mouse to Jobs. It was Jobs, right? They got the mouse, I think. I might be getting it confused. But anyway, IBM saw no value in the mouse, or the GUI, I think, as well, and just handed it off. If you watch Pirates of Silicon Valley, which you should, especially if you're in IT, that's the right. It's a great show. It tells the story of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and how Microsoft and Apple, and you'll be blown away how these dropout college students, like the things they did, and how that story went. Great movie to watch. You really should watch it, especially if you're in IT. All we're doing here, creating another variable, and we're using the date, the event date, which you'll learn about in 17. We're using the event date, which is a custom attribute that we create in 17 in WordPress. And it comes over, and we're using that date because what we want to do is we need to grab the dates, and we need to arrange these posts in a certain way, right? So that they make sense. Or we might need to say we only went from this date to this date, right? And so what we're doing is we're creating that piece of information that allows us to leverage date and time against whether showing or not showing the information. Does that make sense? Data sort. This is the sort that we were talking about. We're bringing this in, and here we're actually creating and using the date to do exactly what I told you. And what we're doing with the date is we're taking the year, the month, and a day. There's many different ways to do this, but I felt this was the one way that hopefully you'd be able to wrap your head around a little better, right? And we're saying, get rid of the dash, because we know the information we get has dashes in between the year, month, and day, right? We're getting rid of it, so we're turning it into this number that's 20171205. Where that comes to our advantage, very simply, is sorting. Because now we're sorting, right? We want them to be in chronological order as we bring these posts in. The order that they're coming in is the order that they were entered in. So you might put your birth date in one place, your birthday in one. You might do your birthday, your 5th birthday, your 10th birthday. That is so rude. 15th birthday. I would do that too, though. I gotta be honest. I'd be all over that horn.
They have to do that legally. Because,
They do. Every crossing.
Yeah.
Every crossing they have to do it.
Like 5 crossings.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if they'll do it at this one, but I know any car crossing, they have to do it. Like you can hear me knocking on the window. Look at him. He's like, I'm gonna run over those regrets. Some old guy in there. So what's cool about with the date is that what we're doing is we're taking the date and we're turning it into a number. Numbers are a computer, right? Computers love numbers. And so it'll sort them more efficiently, right? It's moving 2017 below 2015 if that's the order we want them sorted. And then it's looking at the months and it's, putting December after November, and it's putting December 23rd after December 15th. And that's what's happening, and that's all happening right here. Is that we're sorting them out. The AJAX call is basically, I started talking about AJAX, and I'm sorry, I got to loop back on that. So what AJAX does is basically reaches out to the server on behalf of the browser so that you don't have to do that page load, page load, page load, page load. Great example is Web 115. Great example of using AJAX. If you watch up here, this URL will not change. If I click on things, things change. Not once does this URL change. Not once does the top of the page or the bottom of the page refresh, right? It just goes out and grabs the information that it needs and then pushes it into the page. And that's exactly what we're doing with the timeline. The beauty of this, especially in today's world, if we had to reload our header every time and our footer every time, and we were on Amazon's web servers, that would cost us money. So by not loading the header and the footer every time, in essence, we're saving fractions of a penny, but still it adds up over time, especially after 4 million hits, kind of thing. It adds up. So you're actually saving money because you're transferring less data. You're charged by the data. The other thing is the user experience is much better. You're not waiting for other things to load. Things aren't, you're not getting the blip on the page. You're getting exactly what you asked for with a nice user experience, and that's how it works. This is Web 115 stuff. So what AJAX does is, we learn about methods later. There's post and get. We don't have to dive into them right now. But what AJAX does is, through the browser, it says, go get this link, bring back that information. And that's where we see, when we were looking at this earlier, that's the browser, right? You never see this reload. You never see the top of the page reload. But yet the browser makes 4 calls on our behalf to go get that information, to go get that data. AJAX now is used in a lot of applications, in a lot of programs, in a lot of different things that you don't even realize. Like I'm sure it's a flavor of AJAX in the Alexa app. Not really, but web pages especially. You are able to go grab information and bring it back without the person ever leaving your page, without them having a bad experience. We can do things like this. I do it to be not silly. I do it kind of large and loud. but this loader, right? The nice thing about that is we can communicate with our users and let them know, hey, we're going and getting information, we're bringing it back, hang on a second, and then make it disappear when it comes. And we'll talk about the loader in a minute. Any questions so far? So, what happens here, when we're done looping and going and getting all the data off of the server, what we end up with out here, you don't really see it because it happens so quickly. All of these are lined up on one side of the line. I believe it's to the left. And so what we need to do, after we've loaded everything, because we're loading everything in 4 calls, so we're putting stuff in 4 different times, we're putting stuff in, right? And so we end up with this wonkiness on our timeline, and we want them to be nicely left, right, left, right, left, right. What this wrap up is another function. It's just one more function that we're putting in. And what we're doing is we're looping through, we're looking at the timeline, and we're saying for each item, each LI inside, I want you to do the following. What this code is doing, in short, it's rechecking the data sort, right? And then it's coming down here, and it's either removing, well, it is removing, because what we've done is we've basically assigned in our code, we've told every element to take on the class of timeline inverted, which means they're all on the right. Everything is on the right when it loads. And when we remove that, when we tell it to remove it, and we're just saying the odd ones, right? We're saying go out, look at timeline inverted, and all the odd ones, 1, 3, 5, 7, so on and so forth. I want you to remove this class, because what this class is doing is it's floating it over to the right. It's taking this element and telling it to move to the right. And without that class, it naturally flows to the left. So basically that's what it's doing. It's coming through and it's saying, hey, 1, you're not this guy anymore, move over. Hey, 3, you're not that guy anymore, move over. Make sense? Any questions up to this point? No? Such a talkative class today. What the hell is wrong with you people? I guess 45 minutes of me talking, I probably would start to feel like, oh my God, when's he going to shut up? So what we're doing, last part, and then I'll let you go no matter what time it is. I'll let you go. We have a div here, and it's called the loader div. And through the class, through CSS, we're telling the background of that loader is that image that we see, the one with the funky lines bouncing up and down. And through CSS, we're telling it to sit in the middle of the page. Sit right here in the middle of the page. And the CSS is pretty simple and straightforward, actually. If I go in and I look at it, right here it is. I'm telling it how wide to be, how high to be, the image that I want in the background, right? And we can see that image, which you'll have to push into your images folder. Position absolute. So when you tell it position absolute, what you're telling it is take that element and you place it exactly where I tell you to place it without impacting anything else. So in other words, if I move it somewhere, don't move something out of its way, right? Let it lay over top of it. And you do that by saying top, bottom, left, or right. In this case, I'm doing top and left. And what I'm doing with CSS is I'm telling it to do a calculation. What is 50% from the left minus half the width of the picture? Does that make sense? Good. So when the page loads, this is already sitting there on the page. There's no magic about putting it there. It's just sitting there, right, doing its blippy, bloopy, blippy, bloopy thing. We call the wrap up function when we're done doing that. It comes down here. We talked about, right, organizing the timeline. And then what this is doing is it's looking to the loader div ID, which is right here. And it's saying hide it. And I'm putting a number of 1,000 in there because we're using what's called jQuery, and jQuery has this built-in animated stuff that you can leverage just by saying take 1,000 milliseconds to do it. And if you notice, when we load it, it will disappear. Slowly. Not slowly, but right, it didn't just disappear. You kind of saw it swish away. Explaining for, getting the timeline posts in and things like that are in 17. 17 and 18 are your last, and then there's a little final that Rory and I are throwing together, the other professor. It's not going to be like a memory final where you have to, right? It's going to be more based on what do we learn, and also take one thing that you learned and apply it to your challenges page. That's essentially what it's going to be. So nothing to get stressed over, nothing to worry about. Next week is going to be help, right? Help you get through stuff. This will get posted before Thursday. So Thursday, come in and start working on this, or as soon as it gets posted, I'll be happy to help through that. Additionally, there's probably about 8 more videos, unfortunately, that we didn't get to, which I refuse to jam stuff in just to get it in. I won't do that to my students. I hate it when it happened to me. But they will be available. A link will be sent out to you at some point over the break. You'll get an email, a Slack, and with a link to the remaining steps, and it's up to you whether you want to follow them through or not. But I want to make sure that I make that available to you so that you can. If you're going on to Web 115, you're going to want to go get them done, because when we start in Web 115, we pick up right where we leave off in Web 100. Same thing with Web 200, right? Each of the courses pick up where the last one left off. That's the idea, is that you're building this project throughout your whole academic career here. So, any questions? None? Holy shit.
I did have one question. That bear you were talking about with the bucket and everything like that?
Yep.
That is information. How do you read off that information? Like, do you receive anything after you do that?
After you put the information into it?
Yeah.
Honestly, what happens, so we put the number in the counter, right?
Yes.
So let's say that 10 was passed up here,
Okay.
right? So now the value of that is 10.
Oh, okay.
So are you making sense here?
Making sense.
So when we come down here, that's 10 plus 10. Now 20's passed in there. So now that's 20 plus 10.
And that's how you receive that.
Right.
Gotcha.
Make sense?
Makes sense.
Just like this thing, data, we could call it whatever, but it's data. That's a whole chunk of information that we get from that call, right? Data is this piece right here. It's this whole chunk of information. Good? Nikolai Smirnov? Donny? Sweet? Marco's like, I got this. Get off me. All right, ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful day.